Okay, good stuff. So, ladies and gentlemen, everybody, welcome to our Al-Rilma update dev Q&A live stream. Today we're going to be taking questions from you, the audience, and just discussing what we're going to be doing in the upcoming automation update. Just give you a bit of a rundown of how that's going and what we're working on, and answering your questions about that. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of do a quick, very sort of quick 5-minute overview of what we've been working on and how that's going, and then we'll get some questions going here shortly after that. We're going to keep it to relatively brief, probably no more than 2 hours today, so we're not going to have to hang around forever.
Absolutely. So should I get started with latest activities? So I've been working on something that kind of fits perfectly into the recent rework of how throttle and combustion efficiency and all that works, and I've now completely rewritten parts of the engine simulation to properly cope with temperature and pressures the right way. So if you are so basically what it means is that it now makes a difference if you would drive the car at -5 degrees or at, let's say, 2,000 meters altitude. And that now feeds through properly, so environmental effects are properly taken into account. So it's quite exciting. And that was necessary because of the compound turbos, which did reveal some minor discrepancies. Read into this as major discrepancies. With the mass flow corrections that I was making, turned out they were actually the wrong way around, which is not significant whatsoever as long as you operate at standard temperature and standard pressures, and only with one stage of turbos or compression. But as soon as you go to 2 steps, everything is completely wrong. So that got fixed, and now we have some beautiful updates in that. And that's what I did last week, apart from getting the Nanila track to be worked on by our new 2D artist, which is also pretty exciting. And Kaz, what about you?
Nothing exciting is what you're working on, Rob. A lot of sort of back-end stuff, and just either cleaning up House of Cards, or last week was sort of building effectively like a worker authentication thread for multiplayer, so it can ingest in the server, can ingest in people's cars and score them independently and return the results and such. And that's what I've been racking my hair on.
That is something that people haven't heard much about, of course. So you could briefly tell us a little bit about the current status of the multiplayer, because we've already had a few test runs there with Jay, of course, and the server stuff seemed to be working pretty well.
Yeah, all that's pretty good. I will have much more to probably report next week, because I've basically got that side, the authenticator stuff side, ready to go for Jay to plug in. But as Jay is the one who's working on it, I haven't got it all connected up.
Yeah, I should mention to people who are sort of a little bit less familiar with the development process of automation, or really any other game, but Kaz and the programming team have been extremely busy writing huge amounts of code to get all of this stuff working for us. And it's been a monumental effort for, well, just specifically in the multiplayer, probably for the last, what would you say, Rob, 6 to 8 months or thereabouts?
Yeah, it has been ongoing development during the Ellisbury update already. So
yeah,
that stuff doesn't just appear on our schedule and then we attack that, but rather this is something that, of course, we knew we wanted to implement as soon as we laid out the roadmap for the Supercharger update suite. And it started development work at the start of the Ellisbury update, as we were at that point then trying to get a good foundation for what we knew we wanted to implement anyway. So this is not a thing that you do within just one development cycle. This requires much more background work than that. But yes, that's why multiplayer matches were possible already. Well, even though they're quite limited at the moment with the testing we've been doing, but in principle, server and stuff is already working pretty well, so it's good, looking good.
Yeah, I mean, I've been part of the the very, very early test of the multiplayer, and it's the bare bones of everything that's there is working, and actually working quite well, it seems. There's a lot of polish and stuff that needs to be done. Unfortunately, we aren't quite ready to show anybody that here today in sort of a live session, but maybe in our next one, you know, whenever that happens, we'll have something to show you, and we can actually demonstrate a live scenario-based multiplayer session. It can be as high pressure as you want it to be, but it's a very fast-paced, exciting, if you can believe it, way of playing automation that many of you haven't experienced yet, and I think many of you will quite like when you get it going. So I guess the first question here is, we have a question from Rilo Haken. My one and only question, when will the beta be public? Well, it's going to be a while still, but at the moment, we can't really give you a timeline. I should say, though, that it is probably safe to assume that it's going to be generally the same sort of schedule as we had for the Ellisbury update. So that means, tentatively, we'd be looking at an open beta beginning for like a public open beta sometime late this summer, early fall for Northern Hemisphere players, or late winter, early spring for the Southern Hemisphere players, and a release, all things being equal, by year end.
Yes, that seems about right, yes.
That can be very much subject to change, depending on how things go. It might be earlier, it might be later. It just depends on how things go between here and there. There's a lot of ground to cover still.
Also, what is worth adding, I believe, is that we are very likely to run a closed beta with some more testers before the open beta, because we do have to do some multiplayer testing with more players. And that won't do just releasing that fresh with the open beta. That would be slightly dangerous. There will be some more extensive testing of that aspect beforehand as well. So that's also something for especially those dedicated players that would be joining such an event like this one, would be likely interested in joining.
We are already planning, just for everybody's information, that closed beta test is probably going to be the largest closed beta test we've ever done for automation at any time. So we're going to be getting lots and lots of people in on that, in stages, of course. So as we go along, we'll probably start off with, you know, half a dozen or a dozen people, and then expand that as we feel we need more testers into that program in the lead up to the open beta. Stay tuned for more news later on this year for that. We've got UDG here. Hello.
Hi. Have you guys been, like, what's the deal with, like, turbo tuning, the AI tuning? Has anything been going on there?
I guess that's a me question. So as long as things are in flux, of course, we are not focusing on AI turbo tuning. And with this update, very much things are in flux. Towards the end of this update cycle, we will have another look at the AI kind of presets, the automatic turbo tuning that the AI does, so that the AI can build turbo cars themselves, because currently they can't. They always are naturally aspirated, which of course is giving them a bit of a disadvantage, especially in the 80s, where turbos do add a fair amount of prestige to your cars, apart from, of course, more power and other complications. And that is something that we definitely want to have. Probably, we've been discussing this. Kaz will likely be nodding along to this. We were thinking about the simple turbos, as in turbo and supercharger, not together, but as singular options. Making presets for those and AI tuning for that makes a lot of sense. For the more complex ones, we could say, well, you need to figure this shit out yourself, because it's damn complicated. It's not easy to make those setups work properly, but it is very rewarding when you break through and actually do it. It's a lot of fun. So likely there will be turbo presets again, or auto-tuning for superchargers and singular turbos, but not for the more complex setups.
Okay, our next question is another voice question, and it'll be from Texas Slav. Get you up on stage here.
Okay, so my question is the following. You talked at the start of the session about the new recalculation of throttle mechanics and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question about that is, do you think it'll have any effect on the balance of the game with regards to engines and transmissions and so on? And if it will, have you noticed any effects already, or is that pending testing?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about this a little bit, and the only thing that really comes to mind is how fuel economy works, because the main effect this has is that at low throttle settings, as long as you are on low RPM or low-ish RPM, you will have a lot less pumping losses than you had before. So that might be benefiting fuel economy in general.
Killrob,
Yeah?
do you know how happy I am with that answer?
No, I don't. But please tell me.
Well, you remember that pumping losses are probably the biggest reason for, well, in the current game, especially with its throttle settings, a very big disadvantage for big lazy engines
That's true, yes.
and pushrods and so on.
Right, yeah,
I think-
you're right about that. Yeah,
I
so-
think this makes me very, very happy.
yes, as a true pushrod engine builder, you will be in luck in that regard. So yes, but there is a massive difference in that regard, that there is almost maximum torque already at very low throttle for the lowest of RPMs. As soon as you then hit the power limit of that restrictor plate that is your throttle, you will see the losses again, the pumping losses, of course. But it is in general much more realistic in that sense. The other effect might be, and that remains to be seen because it's not quite implemented that way yet. I think the engine dyno, because the engine dyno was... many people complained about the weird behavior of now having throttle and RPM separated completely. In reality, they are not entirely separated, of course. So you kind of get a progression there. As you push down the throttle, you have more power available to you, and you will naturally go through the rev range. But that might be more connected now again with these changes. But yes, it remains to be seen.
So I know that the most likely answer to this is no, but considering that we are indeed seeing a rebalancing, re-engineering, maybe recoding partially of the throttle mechanics, right? Is there any chance for the implementation of cylinder deactivation?
That is not planned. I wouldn't know where to put it even. And how that would necessarily work in the context of automation, because how do you tell the player that, oh well, currently cylinders are deactivated and that's why you see less power than you would, or have a different efficiency number and so on. It is quite difficult to communicate, apart from, of course, implementing it. And I don't think it is worth the effort it would take to do so.
That's understandable. It's been a very often encountered but not mandatory option on engines. You will see a lot of cars omit it entirely with whenever they go manual, for example. So I understand that it might not be worth the effort if communicating in the UI with the player would be difficult.
Yes, I think that's not only also it's player expectations. Like what does a player who puts that thing on, that feature on, what does he expect from how would the engine behave in automation with that on? And it might be that the only real difference that you would ever notice is in emissions and fuel economy outputs that are kind of a black box until you do the test runs yourself and see the difference. But that is so hardcore and so few people that would actually do it that I think that's too small a subset to cater to in this instance, because we have so many other big items on our list that everyone wants. So yeah, it's a bit of an unfortunate thing that needs to be pushed aside.
That being said, I wonder how small, because I think it's maybe 2 people, is the percentage of people who actually sit through the several minutes of an EPA test or something in this game.
Yeah, I had to. And Cass
Depends
had
on
to.
which test. One of them is like 40 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah, some of them are pretty lengthy.
Oh,
I think
and
it's-
that's including, well, not including, but the one thing I did write in there is, if you've ever noticed, is it auto skips all the time that we're stationary. It does all the calcs, but it doesn't do the test of like we're sitting at the traffic lights for 30 seconds at idle. When you're playing through the test, it just fast forwards through that at like 5 times or something, or 10 times.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Just going back to the throttle, just real quick. The other thing that I was working on as a proof of concept, but sort of waiting on all the other force induction systems, is I have been working on a new engine for the BeamNG exporter, replacing Beam's integrated combustion engine with one that takes all our new throttle maps and everything directly and operates on them, so we get more accurate exports, especially for turbocharged engines.
The little big things, yes, that could be
yeah.
used for exports.
I don't think that's really been mentioned anywhere because it is not in real estate to be shown yet. But yeah, that's going
to be a big deal.
That's something that we hope to get out of this update as well.
It's one of the things that someone would like to talk about for a dev update video or something, but it is not guaranteed that it will happen, or to what degree it will happen and how successful it will be. So it's best to just leave it at that until we have a little bit more to show. But yes, so far things are going pretty well, Kaz.
Yeah, the basic export's a big like 2D data map of throttle versus RPM for the whole engine, and then it looks up the correct throttle and power and torque curves and fuel economy and everything. So it's pretty cool.
That means all of a sudden BeamNG will have realistic engines.
Well, more realistic engines in any case.
Yeah. It's instead of us trying to massage BeamNG's turbos to get what we want, we've just completely rejigged the system.
Okay, we have a text question that's come in from actually a couple of people here. This one's probably directed towards Rob mostly. Is with the discussion we had of the various atmospheric changes and how they have an effect on the dyno, will we actually have the ability to control that either in the engine dyno or in the automation test track simulation manually?
Right, so in one of the developer update videos, I think the first time around I did show the track editor, I was talking about the weather simulation. And the weather simulation would be then considered in your tests. And that is the first point of contact there. And so the answer is definitely a tentative yes, it would matter. And you would be able to some extent, we don't know how yet, to control that. But any way to change the environment or changing a different track, if you wanted to run on the salt flats in the Lure, for instance, you would see higher temperatures, as you would expect. And maybe you would have to knock down and that's a very deliberately chosen word there, knock down, your compression a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to have a pretty profound effect, and it will have much more effect as we go forward with not just this update, but also future updates as well. Let's see here. I will pose this to both Kaz and Rob, and that is, you can build a car in automation to make it real. What kind of a car do you think you would make?
Oh, man, okay. I think Kaz goes first. I'm more creative in that.
Oh, man, I was hoping you would go first.
All right.
Just trying to think.
I would be building the car that I would actually need for the family, as in quite a boring car, but I would make it super fuel efficient and aerodynamically advanced, and I would make damn sure that damn reliability value stays up. But other than that, I'm not that not having high requirements in regards to power or anything. But if you wanted to play that smart, you would build the world's most crazy hypercar and then sell it as a one-off, right? And you would be filthy rich.
I think I've got an answer. So I quite like key cars. We have a Honda S660. So it'd be some little convertible that would be about that size, but with like a little 1-liter engine, turbo. So it's got a bit more brum, but then with 2 little side sponsons, I guess, or whatever, so we can take the dogs in it as well.
Well, that's pretty fun. I think for me, I mean, as a lot of people probably know from all the things that I talk about in the server, I'm a big fan of sort of the fat boy GT cars. So I would probably build something along those lines. Actually, it'd probably just end up being something very similar to what I already own. So kind of a boring answer from me, I'm afraid to say, but there it is. Another question here. We have a voice question from Meep9935. I'll just bring you up on stage here and...
Hello. So this is more like a future question, but will we ever see like more emissions control systems like EGR or secondary air injection to help with NOx emissions, since they're kind of a pain in the ass after like to deal with, like the emission standard 6? Or is that already integrated into like the little clicky thingy that we just click and it's like, hey, guess what?
You mean we fudged it with the emissions optimizations selector there? Yes, partially, but the Euro 6 is definitely not hard to beat, as my Let's Play of this could attest that I basically passed WES 11 in the 80s.
Wow.
That is more of a skill issue there, or a what type of engines you build issue. If you are trying to build 1000 plus horsepower engines and put those into your cars, then of course you will have difficulties passing those standards. But more reasonable ones are not a problem if you sacrifice just a little bit of down low performance or efficiency. I think that this is so EGR is considered to some extent by the cam slider actually. So what we're assuming is that depending on the cam setting and your VVT settings, you are expected to have a certain amount of EGR, and that is just fudged into there. It's not properly simulated as you would, or as you could expect from a game like this, but we fudge that and improve emissions accordingly at low settings for... Let me think, there was something else there. Oh yes, of course. You did see the new heads coming, right? The new head designs. So they are a way to further specify what you want to achieve with your design, and a head that is trimmed towards economy will automatically be considered to have better emissions through features like that. But it is all fudged in there. It is not going to be a choice that you actually actively pick, but it is considered in the grand scheme of things, yes.
Yeah, I did recall seeing that in the update.
Yeah, I should also mention that that is the biggest reason why in modern times we see a lot of manufacturers going to turbo engines, is that getting a naturally aspirated engine to pass, especially a powerful engine like what you see in big trucks or GT cars or sports cars, getting a big naturally aspirated engine or a high-powered, high-tuned naturally aspirated engine to pass modern emissions is very, very difficult and becoming harder and harder all the time. Contrary to what a lot of people think, is that it's not necessarily fuel efficiency why people go to turbocharged engines. It's almost entirely to pass emissions regulations.
Yeah, that's and the beloved Forerunner is currently seeing that same fate with its going from its secondary injected V6 to a Turbo 4.
Exactly. Next question came in it's a text question from Adabak, and that is, will there be custom scenarios for multiplayer games? And the answer to that is yes, there absolutely will be.
Yes, I think Kaz could quickly speak to the various options that we at the moment have in multiplayer for how scenarios are hosted and so on.
Yeah, so I think someone else basically asked a question along this line as well. I've watched go past. There's going to be sort of like official ranked games that rerun ourselves on fixed time slots, a bit like the way sort of iRacing and GT7 has its daily races. So there'll be our sort of on the hour or whatever. We figure out sort of official games that people can join, or people can host their own, make them either public or private with friends, and there is going to be a scenario builder where you can either sort of build a scenario with sort of specific goals in mind, or one that's just a sort of difficulty based on you've got to meet X many requirements or whatever, something along those lines.
Yeah, it's pretty open to and customizable. What we're aiming for is to also have a scenario builder tool. I talked about that briefly in the little dev update, or mentioned it just in passing. But that tool is also going to be used by ourselves to create the curated scenarios. So it will be reasonably powerful and adaptable.
Yeah, and just to answer someone else's questions, there will be a sort of like ELO style rating system.
I've already worked that one out and how it's going to do. So yes, that's
and that again, it will only be like the official matches that go into that.
And the fun thing there is that you can have so many players at the same time. So you know that progressing in score, in ELO score or something akin to that, it can be quite a grind. If you're a really good player and you're in a match with 60 other people, then that is counting as if you're playing 61v1s. So that gives you a quick rise to where you should be, roughly. And I don't know if we can get that done for this update, but some kind of matchmaking mechanic in there, if the lobbies are big enough, would also be kind of handy.
Yeah, that we start to split and stuff. Yeah, I don't know about that.
That would be a longer term goal for sure. Due to the ELO score thing, like a player that is 10 times, that would beat you 10 times out of 11, should be getting a lot less score, of course, by beating you than and you losing basically no score for losing to that player. So it all kind of works, even though you have much better players in there and much worse players in there. So I'm hopeful we can have pretty large games going and it's still feeling good.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting development challenge going forward, how we're going to do all the matchmaking and whatnot, and also how that, various numbers of players are going to interact with one another as they play and as they win and as they lose, because everybody will eventually end up losing a challenge at some point. Doesn't matter how talented you are. Some of them will be actually quite challenging.
Especially if we implement, again, what Debaya just said, the old thing of you only get a limited amount of tests, especially the one where you could only test an engine once.
Yeah, that was a pretty high stakes, where you had one test and you'd better get it right, because if your engine fails or if you just fall flat on your face and don't meet the requirements, well, that's it. You had your one test and you're done.
That is something that is not familiar at all any longer to most of our players, I would think, because back in the day, you have to imagine how it was playing automation back in, I think we switched that system in 2013, 2014 or so.
Yeah, something like that.
The calculations automatically trigger an update. Before that, automation was such in the engine builder that you actually had to go to the dyno and press test engine for all the graphs to update, for all your stats to update. That was super inefficient for gameplay, but that was very akin to having only a limited amount of tests. It feels way better to have everything update instantly, but this mechanic that Martin is mentioning here, Debaya, is basically that, but taken to the extreme, that you only have, say, 3 tries to get the engine right, and your best try of these will count towards your score. So that is going to be a lot of fun. That is pretty much what the best players went towards, I would say, or migrated towards, because that was a real test of skill.
I remember those days quite well. It was pretty high stress automation, but it was actually a lot of fun. It will make you a really good automation player in a real hurry. Okay, we have a text question that came in from Mad with regards to superchargers, and that is, when we get superchargers, will we be able to use multiple superchargers on one engine, like as the Zenvoss or Koenigsegg CCX has? And I think I can answer that in very quickly, and the answer is no, you will not be able to.
Can you imagine how mad it would make Andrew?
Yes. Oh man.
He just bolted upright in bed in a cold sweat and doesn't know why, just at the mere suggestion of that. The reason for that is automation doesn't have the same sort of limitations that the real world has. I mean, in the real world, they only make superchargers of sort of a certain size, and there are also certain packaging limitations in some engines, especially with the one that comes to mind specifically is the Aston Martin Vantage, sort of that wild 80s, 90s twin supercharged V8. It had a very tiny engine bay, and they just couldn't get a supercharger that would be adequate for that engine that would fit inside in the engine bay. But with automation, you're not going to have a limitation of saying, oh, well, the supercharger manufacturers only make superchargers up to this size and then no more than that. You have a lot more freedom than the real world has, so it's just not really going to be necessary to have two superchargers, because apart from the packaging issues and production issues, there's no reason to have two. Next question is from Joseph, and that is, will there ever be a way to limit peak torque, at least in forced induction engines, sort of how modern engines have a very flat, artificial torque and horsepower curve?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. We did consider implementing that, but we're still thinking about it, or I am thinking about how to best implement that, because that would have to be implemented on a simulation level. That you are basically getting the calculations for your result, seeing that it's too large, and then you would have to recalculate that stuff to match what you were expecting by lowering the current boosts setting. And that is scary. It's definitely doable, but I don't know if that is time well spent on that.
Yeah, I guess it would have to be like a dual. It'd have to be like a dual iterative process, wouldn't it? Where we calculate the engine once with no limits.
Yep.
And then we could then produce a boost limit map to then run it through again.
Exactly. But even that, I mean, the engine would react differently than
exactly.
Scaling linearly between what you would expect there. So
you'd have to maybe like run it again and then build another correction. And then just decide how many times we iterate until we get to near enough.
Yeah, this sounds quite expensive there. There are, of course, ways to fudge it. With everything being based off of now simulation calculations, that doesn't quite feel right in the situation to do that. Also, we don't quite know where to put that UI, because it's really filling up. I'm keeping an eye out for a simple enough solution for that, but at the moment it doesn't look too good for that to be implemented.
I can also say that with a little bit of smart tuning, you can actually more or less achieve that result, just with especially changing your camshaft settings and your intake, not just your intake type, but your intake size. You can achieve a very flat linear torque curve. That's, with a little bit of smart tuning, you can actually get it pretty much within a couple of % of the value that you want it to be. Maybe a little bit of a skill issue involved there too, but that's just practice, being able to do that. We've got a voice question come in here from Slim Jim 86. Can you invite it up and join us here on the stage?
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
Hello.
Hello.
All right, so I have a bit of a silly question. So with the introduction of AI company factories, will players have an opportunity to license AI designs? Like, let's say, Aston Martin with the Signet?
Car designs or engine designs?
Car designs.
We do not have any plans to do licensing of car designs. We do have the thought in mind to have an engine market, on the other hand, so that you can be an engine producer, sell to other companies, as well as go to the engine market and request engines from other developers, so that you don't have to build them via a contract factory that is super damn expensive. But then, of course, you can't choose exactly what you want to have, but you're limited to what's on the market. But for cars, or trims, or designs therein, that is not something that we are considering, because after all, that is kind of a core part of the game. And while not everyone likes to design engines, you could also make the argument that not everyone likes to design cars, but this is getting a little too complex, I would say. It's not a silly question, though. I mean, this is done in reality, so.
Yeah, I guess you would also say that engine licensing or buying in engines from other manufacturers is a lot more common.
Right, that makes sense. All right, thank you.
So we'll go to our next test question from Andy D, and that is, beyond AI companies using factories, are there any other major-ish changes for campaign mode planned for the Al-Rilma update?
The one little change I did, which makes AI factories a bit easier, and is actually finally implementing inventory based on region and shipping and possibly import tariffs and all that sort of stuff from country to country.
Right, that's a big one. And I assume with that becomes a lot more viable for us to limit to what regions you want to sell.
Yeah, exactly. So the old system used to just freely distribute all your cars across all markets on as evenly as possible, whereas now it will ship to local markets first and then ships to further away markets, or more expensive to get to markets last. So if you don't have enough production, then the country or region further away won't see as many cars or any cars, and therefore the dealers there are also a bit more sort of upset from the point of view of the cars are more expensive for them because they've got to cover or their sales price is effectively higher because the car is more expensive there.
Yes, looking at my little overview list, I think one thing that I did not mention in the little dev update, nor at any other point, is, or at least officially, is that we are going to have in the campaign setup itself options for emission regulations. So you could then choose to play a campaign where the world never had any limitations on emissions, or one which is even harder than the real world that we currently simulate in terms of emissions. So you can set your own challenge that way and do some more role-playing. And another thing that I see on here that is still a little bit up in the air, but being considered, is to change how production flags are affecting the production of cars. How much limited production and handmade flags are nerfing your production and limiting it. And also changing the concept around a bit to treat different production methods as their own parts. That might seem very abstract to you, but that would mean that we can have some more differentiation between the production processes themselves, making them more interesting, more of a advantage-disadvantage payoff scale that you have to consider. So making factories more important that way. And yes, I think that is it for the campaign, apart from, of course, selling your factories, which I think is a little overdue, but that's going to come.
Yeah, a little bit of automation, the real estate game, tycoon game, coming along.
Oh yeah, because they are fluctuating. So you could do, you could buy lots of land in in good parts of the world when the prices are in the gutter, and then sell them. Yeah, that would be fun. Maybe that could be a good challenge, like to make more than a billion in cash without ever having sold a car. That would be fun.
That might be an interesting achievement, or just have that go along and have the game keep track of how much money you've made on your real estate transactions at the end of your campaign. Okay, we got another voice question here from Crummy.
I have just one simple question. Will we be able to get superchargers in 1946?
Yes, the answer is yes. That is technology that was well established at that point, and you are going to have access to them from the start, which not at amazing quality, of course, because they really sucked ass back then. But yes, they will be available. At least the technology, the parts of them that were. So not centrifugal and not screw, but you will have roots, I would assume. Is that correct, Kaz and Chris?
I believe that was sort of the only type that was available. I think twin screw was just starting in its infancy in the late 1940s, because it was post-war technology. Or roots superchargers were around basically from almost as soon as cars were invented, to be honest, and used on them. So you will absolutely have root superchargers available from day one.
Oh, nice.
We have a question from NH Augustus, text question, and it's probably tying in a little bit with the boost limit, and that is, would we ever consider having the ability to add either a rising or descending boost curve for your automation engine?
That is a good one, because that reminds me of one of the proposed solutions And that was that we have a instead of having a torque limit that you set, we have a boost curve that you can control via control points. So you add a control point, you have a little graph, and then you say, well, at this RPM I have a maximum boost of 1 bar, and at this, the curve goes up to 1.2, and then it drops down to 0.8 at the end. Something like this. And that would only require 1 run of the simulation. So if that UI challenge was possible to be solved in a neat way and not produce too much work, then that would actually be more viable than having the boost limiter be automated by setting a torque limit. I don't know how much bullets Isaac would be sweating for having that kind of feature in there UI-wise, but...
Yeah, that might be a bit of a challenge. Okay, we got another voice question coming up here from Sisyphus.
Hi.
Hello.
I asked the text question whether superchargers would be added, and you said yes, but you didn't answer whether you would be able to twin charge engines with both a supercharger and a turbocharger.
That is definitely going to be part of it, and you did see it if you paid very close attention to the screen that I showed from in-game, that was an option, twin charging. So yes, there is an option for having a supercharger first and a turbo second in the second stage, and it would either be clutch controlled or not. You would be able to have some control over that in access to just choosing that option, yes.
Another voice question from Meat9935.
Hey, this is pertaining to the superchargers. Will there be a less boost limit than turbo, since in real life we don't really see superchargers go past maybe 1 bar, if that, or is it just gonna have the same range as turbos because fuck realism and have fun?
I'm going to model the supercharger compressor maps according to real-life examples of superchargers. And that means that they will have realistic limitations. Modern ones can go pretty high, like 2 bars of boost are attainable by those. But yes, there are no superchargers that do, at least to my knowledge, that do a 5 bar of boost, no. But that is not really their role either. You have compound turbocharging if you want to have high boost. It's not really relevant, I would say, but yes, they are going to be realistic in that way, that they follow the real world to a large extent.
Next up is a question from Zenturi, and that is, will we see the standalone track editor publicly? And if so, will you host competitions on track designs, much like sort of how current car design competitions work? And the answer to that is, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be able to hold public track design competitions. In fact, I think that would be a really fun thing to do.
Especially considering that the standalone track editor, which is going to be public, yes, going to have an export feature which directly is packaging it as a mod. So it is very easy to share your tracks as well. So it would make perfect sense from a community point of view to have competitions and promote the best entries in that for everyone to try out. Yes, absolutely.
I should also mention that we are, at least I believe we still are, Rob, we're still planning on having the track editor export directly to the Steam Workshop.
Yes, I believe so. I don't think that is implemented yet, but the export functionality of tracks and packaging and so on is pretty far advanced already in the standalone track editor. So it is much more complex than one would think, because texture sizes are massive. So you would think that, oh yeah, okay, it's just a picture and cars are driving around. But no, that's not quite what's going on. So what we are currently doing is we are splitting the track into segments or tiles of 512 pixels wide and high, and there are more layers to a track than that, because you will have a sunny version, a overcast version of the same thing, and then you will have, for each track variation or track layout that is on that map, you will have a rubber layer. So as your cars are driving around that, rubber can be added dynamically, but also the weather can be dynamic in that it then via a cloud layer that is being calculated can blend the overcast and the sunny layer to give really quite realistic and beautiful weather effects. So that is exporting all of that and keeping track of things is quite challenging at 8K resolution.
Yeah, and it's going to make things, well, especially if we get exporting to the workshop work, it's going to be a lot simpler and a lot easier for the player base to actually find and use custom tracks, because as it is right now, basically it's just one tiny little section of the official automation forums where we have a bunch of tracks that people have uploaded from since we've actually had that system implemented, which is, I believe, how long have we had that? Since 2015, I believe it was.
Oh, maybe
2014, somewhere in there.
Maybe even earlier.
I think it might be earlier. Yeah.
So all the official tracks we will redo by just upscaling, for the most part, upscaling them and then building the track splines and such to be compatible with the new system. So basically just redesigning them in the editor, which is quite easy to do because the editor is awesome. So all the tracks that are in the game at the moment, they will be in the game with the new version, but the old mod tracks will have to be remade.
Yeah, it's a very, very different system with the old tracks. That is unfortunate, but
I think people can wait the 2.5 hours it will take for the first Nordschleife to appear on the workshop.
Yeah, exactly. That'll be a very quick one, and I imagine pretty much every Grand Prix track will be up by the end of the week after that.
Yes.
So there will be no shortage of tracks to use. We have a voice question again from Texas Slav. Get you invited up here.
We had a question recently about the limitations of superchargers regarding boost. I mean, the real-life limitation, the real-life reason they don't tend to be very extremely boosty is because that takes a lot of power away from the engine. It places the crank under a lot of stress. Like, a supercharger will still, for the most part, usually make more power than it takes. However, that crank question, the question of smooth engagement whenever you have a clutch or something, would be an issue, right? So my question is, following on from that, the problem of superchargers stressing the crank more than the actual power output, how is it going to be addressed? Is there going to be, for example, a line that projects how much horsepower the engine is actually making prior to the parasitic loss?
Oh, that would also require two separate calculations because they're so intertwined that everything depends on each other that we probably won't be able to show the NA only output because they're not actually disconnected from each other. There is only the version that only the proper result is what is being calculated, and it is not based on an NA engine and then a supercharger is tucked on top of it. That is not how it works. It is properly going through and doing all the losses and the air compression and everything and heating up of the air, and only that is being seen by the engine. So we wouldn't be able to separate that with a single calculation. And I don't know how valuable it would be to have the NA results shown at the same time, because how would that even work? Like, what design choices should be considered for that, for intakes or manifolds and headers and all that? So I don't know if that is all too useful. But to answer the main question, if that will be considered as for the crank and the torque and everything, yes, I believe especially the clutch engagement being quite snappy can be seen as, would probably be implemented as a fudge factor to reliability or to stress reliability in that sense, that you have a slightly lower limit depending on how beefy the supercharger is and how much power it takes compared to how much the capacity of the engine is and how strong the crank is and so on. So yes, or supercharger torque versus the expected torque from the engine or torque limit of the crank. Yes.
That makes sense, but the question about the other output, I did not mean the NA output. What I was talking about is that there is a output
that the engine has in terms of before the parasitic loss of the supercharger. So, for example,
I see.
you
Okay,
make an
now I get
SLR,
it.
right?
Yeah. Now I get it.
And it makes 700 horsepower, but after, or maybe 750, but after the supercharger takes its due, what makes it to the crank or to the drive shaft is 620.
Yes, and you're right about that. That doesn't require more than one calculation, so that is pretty easy to take out because that is a value that is being calculated, or it is just being subtracted, just like you described it. It's just being subtracted at the end of a full loop of the calculation for that point of throttle and RPM. So we could have a map of supercharger parasitic loss. We could make that, yes. That would be actually be reasonably easy to make.
That is what I was really looking for, because the crank will be basically, I mean, taking the torque of the engine before the parasitic loss, so and as opposed to the torque that you get on a power graph or on the stats sheet of a car. So that was the question. It was brought up sometime, maybe several months, maybe a year ago, in game feedback that implementing superchargers would face the challenge of, well, actually, they make the crank more brittle.
Yes. Okay. Well, that makes perfect sense, and yeah, that is not only easy enough to implement, but also very much reasonable to do it that way. So yes, I will break out that kind of data in an array, and then we can just plot it, and also consider the torque before the parasitic loss as what is considered for the crank itself. That, yeah, plus a little bit for clutch, of course, because that is changing torque demand so rapidly that there's probably some additional torsional stress and so on involved.
Well, okay. Thank you very much for the answer. That was pretty much what I was looking to hash out.
So we got actually, it's not really a question that's come up, it's more sort of a discussion that's been going on in the chat window, is talking about body and fixture content within automation and why it takes so long. Well, the reason why is because it's a lot of work. Even just a quote-unquote relatively simple body family, like what we tend to add with every major update, those are several hundred hours worth of work for the artists to make. Not just in terms of just the basic modeling, but getting all the shape keys and morph set up, which is a huge amount of work, because a lot of how the morphs work is kind of trial and error. Basically, the artist has an idea, and then they try to implement it to see if it actually even works or not. Because sometimes you might have this grand idea for a mod, or sorry, a morph on a body, and it just doesn't work. Like, it creates strange geometries that with the triangles within the model itself, and it causes reflections to look weird. It causes fixtures to not conform properly. It causes a lot of tearing and so on. So there is a lot of trial and error that goes into the process of creating an automation mod, specifically body mods. It's just a huge amount of work for our relatively limited art team. The same actually kind of goes for fixtures too, because they're complicated, but in kind of very different ways, because they have a lot of functionality built into them. Like, is it a light? How do certain materials work within the fixture as it scales and changes shape and whatnot? So it's a very complicated process, and unfortunately it's not really a process that can be simplified on our end. It's basically as simple as it can be already, and it's still very complicated. So
also, one should add to that we don't have magic tools. We are using the exact same tools as the modders use. There is no simple solution there, so we have to deal with exactly the same thing as the modders.
So believe me, we'd love to create huge amounts of new content, but it's just not really that feasible to generate stuff, at a really high rate, because it is such a complicated process. I don't know if Endfinity, if you'd like to step up onto stage here just for a little bit. We are talking about boost controllers and BeamNG exports.
Right, yeah. Hello.
Hello, welcome Endfinity.
Since we're kind of reworking the Beam engine stuff, in theory, we could do this, add boost control that you can adjust at runtime, so to say. I'm just not really sure how worth it is, because that will take like some effort that could go elsewhere instead, because it is a very niche thing to do. Like, how often do you really need to adjust your boost on the go? I'm not sure. It is something we can think about, though.
It is a very aftermarket thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
Probably,
it's
yeah.
It's more of almost a motorsports thing, really, of like, based on track conditions and stuff, you might be tempted to turn the peak boost down.
Although I don't think it would be super difficult to implement. Well, we'll see about it.
Yeah, the thing with the exporter is that it's such a complicated beast. There's always something that needs a lot of attention with that. Just to sort of elaborate on that, it's one of the reasons why, you know, things kind of take a little longer than people expect and or would like them to be. Is just there's so much going on there, and there's so many things that, you know, we're trying to improve and make better and function more accurately, that we just kind of have to prioritize what we're working on to sort of take care of the, I wouldn't say the easy fixes, but the fixes that have the most impact. So that's why sometimes a lot of features that you think would be really nice to have just either don't get implemented or take a really long time to make it into the exporter.
And sometimes, like for example, I will start working on some feature and then realize that it's not really feasible to finish. I think one of those was the gearbox damage, the torque damage from automation. I tried implementing that into Beam, and it really did not feel very good because of how Beam stuff works.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is that sometimes we implement something and it just doesn't work the way we want it to. So we have to scrap it or rethink it, or wait for other features within automation to come along and make that job a lot easier. Okay, another question here. This is a text question from Texas Slav, and that is, are we able to share any details about the reliability stat revamp?
I certainly would if I had attacked it already. But no, it's still just planned to happen. And it will be more consistent than what currently is, and it will take into account that the component that is the least reliable will affect your reliability the most, because it drags down everything else. But other than that, I do not have any concrete things to show you in terms of how it's going to be implemented. It is, I think, to the player, it won't be noticeable as a massive change, but it will just, in the background, feel quite a bit better and more consistent.
Another question from our 10K Ask Us Anything, and that is, this is more of a technical question explaining how a system works within automation, and that is, how is sound generated?
That is definitely a CAS thing.
So we just have a heap of various sound banks for all the engine types, for both off and on load, separate intake and exhaust, for then how open and closed the exhaust and intakes are, and then we sort of dynamically blend them all together based on your choice parameters when you design an engine, and then that's what's sort of mixed together and thrown out on the export to Beam, which is also why occasionally you get that horrendous robotic noise, is when things sort of go out of phase. And it's a very, very hard challenge to fix.
And not just a hard challenge to fix, but a controversial one, because it seems like anytime we make a change, some people will be, oh, that's a fantastic change, that's wonderful. And then we'll get another group of people with the pitchforks and torches out, and they're absolutely furious about it. We got a question here about multiplayer, and that is it going to have voice chat? And the answer to that is emphatically no.
Not even normal chat, by the way.
Because the reason why we don't want to do that is it really complicates, well, for one, we don't want people just being like totally awful to one another in that, but it also, from a business perspective, it makes it very complicated to and challenging to rate automation in terms of age. So when we have something like that, that means we have to have software ratings for age appropriate, for basically what age is appropriate to use automation, and that becomes kind of a limiting factor, especially on Steam selling into just I believe mostly it's a European problem that they, if you have functions like that, it automatically becomes like 16 plus, and we don't really want to limit automation as such, I don't think.
Yeah, and there are so many good tools to do voice chat with. Like you're on one right now, Discord, and why not use that for your games? If you really want to be hanging out with a group of friends, you can do that however you like, but it doesn't have to be in the game with 60 other people.
As I say, the only games I like the voice chats are is like games where the voice chat's spatially aware, like Squad or something like that. Aside from that, then you just use Discord or whatever your favorite.
If you're in the same diner room, you can talk if the engine is not running at the moment, because that would drown it out. Yeah.
We have kind of toyed around with the idea of just letting people do reacts and stuff in sort of a chat window, but I'm not even sure we're going to do that necessarily. We have another voice question from Meek9935. Seems to be absolutely full of questions today, so welcome back to the stage.
As for superchargers again, so in Killrob's little video they uploaded earlier this week, the supercharger defaulted to 4 liters on a 4-cylinder. Would the size scale with the engine size, or is it just a set size?
The way it worked within the implementation that you saw in the video was a very simplistic, please just throw some scaling in there for now, we'll fix everything later. So what you saw was just a slider between 0 and 1 that mapped on the whole scale that somewhat seemed reasonable, like, what's the smallest size of supercharger? Well, it's something like 150cc, and then you go all the way up to 4 liters. You probably never use it, but that is not how it's going to scale, but it is going to scale in the same way as turbos are. You can put a 120mm turbo on a tiny inline 3, I believe. There is no limitation to that, and that's going to be the same thing for the superchargers, I would assume, unless the piping and the connection art-wise has some limitations to them that need to be limited in order to limit the space of different possibilities that would be really hard to deal with art-wise. So unless there are challenges in that regard, the scale will be completely free. And if you want to put a supercharger on there that the engine can't even turn, then well, that's on you.
Okay, this is a question we kind of get every once in a while, but I don't think we've actually had it answered in one of our live streams yet, and that's from V7 Stoner, and that is the discussion of, are there any plans to add transaxle type transmissions to automation, sort of like what you'd see in a Corvette or a Porsche 944 or 928, where you have a front engine but a rear mounted transmission?
I was thinking about that the other day.
And what was your conclusion?
Where will we fit it in any of the selection boxes? But I would like to see it because it is quite a cool option.
Also, you could say that we already fudge it with the slider that allows you to shift weight. But speaking of that, I think the desire to have that feature mainly comes from the weight balance of the car, unless I'm completely mistaken here. And what we are planning to do for this update is to extend the range of the weights distribution slider so that you have more options there and can tune it more. And you can roleplay that is Transaxle if you want to.
Okay, the next question we have is from Altab8187, and that is the process of animating fixtures planning to be made more streamlined? Endfinity might be able to speak to that a little bit, but
yeah.
I think the general idea is the system we have right now is essentially a very, very, very early prototype of something we're thinking of planning on implementing, but haven't really found out a good way. Is that accurate?
I mean, what we have right now is basically a debugging kind of method, which was not really meant to be used as extensively as it is right now, but still. So I don't think we are going to do it in a way where you have certain fixtures with predefined functions, because that is a whole another can of worms. There are a lot of fixtures that will have to be reworked, or fixtures that you expect to behave in a certain way but for some reason don't. So it will still probably stay a kind of semi-manual process where you define what kind of function you want the fixture to have. But of course, it's not in the end going to be like made through the description, because that is a terrible process. The problem with animated fixtures right now is that it is very difficult for the exporter to know which fixture is supposed to have which function that you define. And in order to fix that, we have to make some changes elsewhere in the way that the game talks to the exporter first. And once we have that done, we can work on a more streamlined process of setting the functions. It will probably be some kind of UI for each fixture that you said, but it's still kind of too early to say about that. The UI is kind of a separate problem that will have to be solved. But yeah, it will definitely be more streamlined than it is right now, because right now it is not streamlined at all. And hopefully it will be much easier and much more intuitive to use.
The only way of making it less user-friendly at the moment is if you had to write in the description box in assembler code. That would be an upgrade for sure, yes.
As for stuff on the automation end of things, we are pondering the possibility of actually giving tools to our mod makers and contractors the ability to make fixtures to have sort of built-in animations with that. But that's really, we've just, I mean, I think the most thought we put into that is, wouldn't that be a cool thing to do? And we haven't really put any more thought into it than that. Let's see here. Texas Lab has had another thought. We'll bring him back up on stage here.
You'll be delighted to know it's incredibly unoriginal. It's more of a...
No, not diesels, please.
Kind of an obligatory thing that we kind of have to go over whenever... Yeah, actually, Ivan in the text chat is asking a similar thing. There has been in the Q&A kind of a little wink that if the game does well, and if we have time, and if we have the resources, and if the sound fonts will be there, we might do a small engine DLC and a large engine DLC after the game is complete in a way.
That is correct, yes.
And yeah, the question is, what is the status of that might? Is it closer to a no? Is it closer to a yes? And how many? And how supposedly far are we in terms of number of updates from the game being complete enough for you to consider that?
Right. So I think there's there's not much hiding any answers needed here. So what our plans are for the Supercharger update suite is to finish up the core of the game. That is the engine designer and the car designer and multiplayer, so that it's as a core game, it's finished. And then the campaign mode becomes our next main focus in terms of development. But that means that the core game on the side is mostly done. And then it's mostly a question of artist time. And we do have the sounds for the configurations already. The last time we ordered sounds from the creator of those sounds, which wasn't the most reliable, let's put it like this, we ordered them wisely a long time before we actually needed them, so we do have them. And that means the only thing that is missing to make those engine types work, will be the art. And depending on how much time the art team has to work on those engines, that would be the answer to, like, if we get them sooner or later. Because the focus after the core designers are done will be shifted towards the campaign. But the campaign naturally doesn't include all that much art. So there is a good chance that these are coming in the not too distant future. So it's not a 2077 thing, but not a Duke Nukem Forever thing either. But
maybe a 2055 thing.
Yeah, that's more there. Yes. No, but especially the smaller engines don't have the hideous amount of fuel system combinations that you would have on larger engines. So art-wise, they are a little bit less of a pain to make, but still, we do want to have. Yeah, so it is also depending on the looks of it, because you have to consider that there is a large chunk of people who absolutely wants to hang us for potentially releasing DLC before the, in air quotes, game is done, right? So that is another thing that we want to remain consistent on, because we have so far, even though it doesn't seem like it with the V16 DLC, but everyone who has read the FAQ knows that that was an ancient, before early access existed, pre-order bonus. So we have given that to those who have supported us from the very start by buying the version that was more expensive and supported our development. And unfortunately, within Steam, that had to be done via a DLC, which looks bad and from a moral perspective is kind of looking really bad, because you shouldn't release DLC for unfinished games. So that is another limiting factor, even though we would be able to provide to you the engines potentially sooner. That is another thing to consider, at least.
That's understandable, although I will say that on the bright side, if you do that, you can consider yourself among the ranks of AAA game designers.
Yeah, well, no morals to be found, yes. It's mostly not the designers in that instance, though, but rather the publisher that is pushing for that. But fortunately, we don't have those constraints.
I'm just trying to figure out if I'll ever have my massive, unreasonable 2.8 liter V4s.
Yeah, I think that's quite likely, actually, because making the engine types is something that is nicely compartmentalized. It's a known difficulty to that. It's not something that we haven't done before, so it's a very safe thing to do.
Does the dev team not hate to do that?
And I mean, the calculations are done. We have in the code for most of the, I think for all of the configurations, we all actually have placeholder values that all make sense. So calculation-wise, we could just switch them on and they would be there. But of course, all the art is missing.
The smoothness values of 0 and 100 will now be possible.
Yeah, well, the zero you can already have with your inline freeze, right? So,
and I'd like to also add here, with respect to building your extremely unreasonable 2.8 liter inline fours, why would you only limit yourself to that when you'll be able to build much larger ones? Like that doubled essentially.
Yeah, 4.5 or it would be about what 5.3, 5.4 liter V4s.
Yeah, sounds about right, and not recommended.
I think maybe we should talk about that, Rob. The fact that we're going to be expanding bore and stroke limits in the Al-Rilma update slightly.
Yeah, that's a maybe. It's a maybe, but we are experimenting with bore stroke limit changes in range, expanding it. The simulation end of things that I've been writing doesn't know any of these limitations. It just calculates it through, and it works with a bore of 180, just as well as with a bore of 120. Or 30, for that matter. So what we're currently just trying out is how much actually breaks if we extend the limit. So it's very simple to flick a switch and just extend the limit, but it's probably that leaves a massive rat's tail of consequences that we don't want. So that is what we are trying to find out in balancing, and just see how super small and super large engines would react, and what would have to change in order to make that range actually workable. And if it becomes workable without too much effort, we would expand the range of possibilities there.
I think that was quite an expose you've bestowed upon us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thanks for the question again. We have not actually kind of answered a voice question that had come up in the discussion. So that's, hopefully that answered your question a little bit there, V7 Stoner. We have another voice question from Crummy.
It's just popped into my mind when you're talking about the capacity, is that when you're making like really small engines, the exhaust slider is quite like, the jumps are quite big.
Yeah.
When you're considering like a small engine, and also have happened that I like to like optimize my engines, and I saw that I could have made the exhaust smaller.
It's not hard at all, apart from that the slider will have to be really awkward. So one that was recently discussed, I don't know if you were part of that. There was a thread on here in the suggestions forum and on the Discord. The solution that I would be going for is, because all the exhaust sizes are inch-based, is that if you are below 2 inch in exhaust size, the step size would go from a 1/4 inch to an 1/8 inch. So naturally you would have twice the granularity that you have at the moment. And that would also make then sense to allow for even smaller exhausts. So I think that would cover most of the options there. I think it is currently, like you say, for really small engines, it is super awkward. I've, as you've also seen in my recent Let's Play there, that was about just key car engines.
Yeah.
Very noticeable, very, very noticeable that there is granularity lacking, and that is somewhat easy to address, and we will.
Okay, another voice question from NH Augustus. I'll get you invited up here, and
I asked a question earlier about the variable boost by RPM. And I have a suggestion on potentially how you could do that. I don't know how difficult this would be. Something like you have with the gear ratios, where you can switch to a more advanced menu and, for example, have 6 different sliders that you divide the RPM band up in 6 different categories, and you put the target boost values for each of those target RPMs, and then you just fill in a line in between, or you put another slider where the turbos already are, and you have a slider that moves the peak boost to later or earlier, because if I look at the new design, it looks like there's space there, but I don't know how difficult that would be.
That's bringing up a pretty good point about the UI and what I previously said about the... Basically what this would be is a different way to interact with the graph node drawing thing that I described before, where you just have as a starting point a flat line, which is your boost limit, as you go in there, and then you have either sliders, or you can set control points and pull them up and down, whatever RPM you want, and have the interaction be linear in between those points. So yes, I think that does make sense to have some kind of... If we were going for this, of course, that's the caveat. If we were going for this and actually implementing it, a boost by RPM limit could be interacted with in the way you describe. That would not necessarily require very precise mouse interactions, because you have the sliders. So that might be a good alternative UI for that. But I think from a space point of view, or UI efficiency point of view, a graph-based interaction would probably be easier to put in a reasonable way.
another voice question from Henpause.
So this is, I think, a question that a lot of people have had on their mind, particularly with the current Mille Monte challenge going on. But like with the change to how tracks work, is a change also planned with like the AI for the driver? Because as it stands, the AI driver is extremely conservative.
On the
Like,
downshift especially, right? Yeah.
yes, no, like, yeah, it had to the point where it has affected how people are building their cars for the Millimonte, because like high revving cars are just like worse because of that.
Yes, that's mostly a thing Cass is working on, but that is a definite thing that we do need to address, as naturally slowing down and just staying in gear is costing lots of track time there. Is that something that you already have had a look at, Kaz, or what is your perspective on this?
I haven't had a look at it. Teaching our robot Stig to drive is quite the challenge. And trying to make the system is sort of generic. It's in some ways it's teaching the fuel economy driver to drive like a race car driver. It both sort of uses the same system. It does have logic in there to make it aware that we're on a racetrack and we aren't driving the economy sim. So I probably need to dive in there and just teach it better. Send it to track school.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know how much that's possible, like in terms of like pushing like through corners. That's a more minor thing, but yeah, definitely downshift logic feels like it's definitely due for a once over.
The actual cornering and calculations for that are completely going to be revised with the next update.
All right.
The next big update, anyway. So it is only going to be the shift logic then that is limiting you, but that should be reasonably easy to figure out.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just to add to that, as Rob mentioned in our dev update videos, that as we see the track simulation right now in the Ellsbury update, it's very much in a state of flux. So there are a lot of things we're going to be working on both in this upcoming update and also the following one, the Terzo update. So what you see right now is far from a finished product. Next question, another one from Texas Lab.
Well, I just realized something. We're talking about shift logic, and Kaz is here. I have a question. I know that this is something that's going to be changing in the near future, and that's why I'm asking this about the launch logic of various transmissions, specifically as it pertains to stats and the acceleration profile of a car. The logic of clutches and the logic of torque converters and the logic of whatever on earth CVTs have, probably torque converters. Is there anything you could say about how that will be changing?
So the current observation, I believe, is that the manual gearbox basically uses a perfect clutch dump and has more or less infinite acceleration or near optimal acceleration for the power that is potentially available to it, while the torque converter isn't using its full potential due to the logic the way it is at the moment. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, and I believe I've also gotten out of you the statement, we know that the logic is faulty.
So then it becomes a CAS thing here. I don't think you have been working on this recently.
No, I haven't touched that since I rewrote it all sort of towards the end of last update. Which generally, like, the way this sort of cycles is, or seems to happen is, we take a good stab at what we think it should work, then the community comes back and has their valid criticisms, and then I think about it a lot more.
Well,
and then sort of iterate on it again. It's also sort of quite a challenging. There's a lot of questions that are being asked, like when you're trying to hard launch a car, like internally, like what you're trying to process is like you have a feeling of how much grip you have, so therefore you get sort of a feeling of how much revs to bring on board before you slip the clutch, how much you're slipping the clutch. There's all that sort of stuff. And so trying to figure out a nice way for the simulation to figure out what it needs to do. Yeah, it's a tricky problem to solve, and yeah, we'll see how we go.
That's understandable. As far as I understand, right, the current automatic launch logic is torque converter, but basically without preload or something. Feels like you.
Yeah, a similar sort of thing. Like what the simulation actually does is it understands how much torque the tires can cope with before they will slip, and so the track simulation is basically going like the cars have this much longitudinal force that they can cope with, and then so from launch it goes, how can we get as close to that as possible, and then because we now have all the dynamic throttle maps with like torque versus throttle versus RPM, it sort of tries to choose a good starting point for that, and then works through the model of either the torque converter or the clutch to then put that power down through the transmission, etc., etc., etc.
One of which being a bit tougher than the other, as far as I understand.
It tries for the most optimal solution, and because it's a robot, it can often get to the perfect optimal solution that you wouldn't possibly really be able to do in real life.
Definitely, but yeah, that's kind of there was a lot of flux back when transmissions got reworked at all, when they implemented the current model of shift times, which was a subject of intense scrutiny at the time. I think all of you will remember.
Oh yes, but that did get changed, right? So shift times were adjusted.
The shift times right now, I think not many people have much of a problem with those, but there was this very interesting pendulum where the meta between whether manuals or automatic were actually faster flipped multiple times. And the current status of all those flip-flops is that because of the massive loss of area under the curve that automatics experience, they're slower again, and by quite a serious amount into 2020, unless you just stuff double the gears into the initial acceleration range.
Yes, definitely something that we should be looking at. But as you also can understand, there are functionally there are bigger fish to fry at the moment, and so it will be more of a thing that once we get to polishing, that we are going to look into that.
Okay, thank you for your question. Another voice question here from V7 Stoner. Just to let everybody know, we are getting down to sort of the last 10 minutes or thereabouts, so we'll take probably 3 more questions, and I think we'll call it a day here.
Discounting forced induction types and different fuel types. We have certain amounts of engine development points that we can adjust, like valve timing, lifter strength, stuff like that. My question is, have the number of those points been finalized, or are you planning on adding more stuff like number of spark plugs, combustion chamber shape, stuff like that? It's a theoretical question, it's not stuff I'm asking for another update, I'm just wondering.
So for the most part, the number of options available are now finalized, apart from the main revamp stuff that I mentioned for the heads in the little dev update, that is going to be revised. It always comes down to, especially what you mentioned, like spark plugs and all that you have to ask yourself the question, can this be simulated by just increasing the quality slider by 1 or 2 steps? If the answer to that is yes, then it will certainly not make it into the game, because that means it is not an interesting enough design decision to be considered in the grand scheme of things, and that is something that we are quite keen on keeping that way. More options doesn't mean better game. It often means more bloated game in general, especially when it comes to options that don't have much weight to them. So we're trying to let the UI that we have limit ourselves to have constraints, which means that within those constraints, within the number of options that we are given by the UI space, we want to get the most out of it. Like the most important design decisions that you could make within that section of design. And I think those are quite nicely settled at the moment, where no big things are missing, and the space is being used up.
Well, thank you for the clarification. The current layout is very nice, and I can't wait for the next update.
Oh, thank you.
We have another voice question from Andy D.
Hi. So, are there any current plans to have another look at the suspension, so to make double wishbone less overpowered and to make solid area axles less terrible? So to have more meaningful choices for the current suspension options?
That is a pure balancing thing, so the answer to that is always yes. We are keen on looking at that, and any weird matters that are not quite realistic should be considered to be rebalanced. That is something that is reasonably easy to do. It does require careful investigation of what the actual issue is in terms of stats, like which choice is overpowered in what situation. But as soon as that has been figured out, the actual change to the stats is very straightforward and like a 10-minute thing. So yes, anything that is balance related like this is we are always keen to look at, and I think the more people are going to play, and I think this will be accelerating during multiplayer, because multiplayer and competitive play usually elevates any kind of little advantages that you can get and makes them the dominant meta and really highlights the flaws in the balance of the game. So we're definitely going to take a look at that and see how we better can put that in. There was also, while you're talking about this, I want to add there was a pretty good suggestion by a long-time community member in the YouTube comments of the little dev update, which was that there is not much choice currently or much progression that exists for ladder frames, and that is, for instance, something that is quite easy to change, because we could add heavy-duty ladder frames that would fit the niche of being viable even in modern times for heavy-duty vehicles, or in old times for more comfort-oriented vehicles, like really premium stuff, heavy stuff, where the normal ladder is being phased out due to not reliability, sorry, the safety issues it has. But the heavy-duty one, while being heavier and material-wise a bit more costly, doesn't have necessarily the same problem there. So it is a nicer compromise. And that is very much possible to make, because we could just reuse the same art. It just has different stats, and that's my point here. As long as it's just different stats to something, it is quite easy to add if there's UI space for it, and in that case, there is.
All right, cool, thanks.
I think we will end off with just one quick question here, and this was actually asked kind of a while ago. It was more of a statement, but that is with respect to, are we planning on adding any more fixture materials to automation? Because people were saying that, they always want more, and it's some of the options are maybe perhaps a little bit on the boring side. And the answer to that is, number one, a lot of that is actually moddable these days by community modders. Whether they're adding in, well, for example, like the PBR Plus mod for paints and whatnot, you can do that. The other thing is, we're always looking to add more stuff in terms of materials and whatnot and fixtures, just as we're adding any other content. But the issue is, we have to be very careful to operate within some very tight constraints with those, because certain materials, as we've all seen, don't export to BeamNG well, or even in some cases at all. That is always going to be a challenge that we have to be mindful of, because our system is quite a bit more flexible and versatile than BeamNG's engine is for that. Just simply because they've essentially written entirely their own game engine for BeamNG, and we're operating on Unreal Engine, which is kind of like one of the default game development engines in in this world, so we just have a lot more options of things that we can do with that than they would have. I should also say that you can, with the user texture function, that you can basically import your own custom textures into the game. You have the ability to do quite a bit of things yourself in that regards as well, without even having to go to modding in new materials. So I guess the short answer to that is yes, we're looking to add in more stuff, but we are limited with what we can do because we want everything that we have in automation as default materials, or as materials included in the game, to work properly and under as many, if not all, of the circumstances we can foresee. There's also the possibility that you can add in your own stuff, either through the user texture function or just modding it in yourself.
I think this is now exactly time for a wrap-up.
I think so. So thank you for everybody who stuck around with us for these couple hours. You asked a lot of really great questions, and I think we covered a lot of things that people were curious about, but never really had a chance to ask anybody on the development team about. So we thank you for taking the time to do that, and thank you for asking us some good questions, because it's actually quite thought-provoking for us too. You know, it gives us an idea to think about things in ways we didn't necessarily do before. So we're always thankful for the opportunity to chat with the community in that regard. It's beneficial for everybody. And I think on that note, Rob, it is time for your catchphrase.
And with that, I hope you enjoyed, and I shall see you guys next time.